today's webinar, we're going to talk about modeling and analyzing scenarios, and in particular using dashboards to do this type of analysis. So what I'll do is I'll start by showing you an example model that was used for a real project, and I'll just demonstrate how this model is used to, it's used with scenarios and a dashboard to do scenario analysis. And after showing you how it works as an end product, then I will go and show you step by step how to develop this kind of model. So with this model, this is it's a simulation of water diversions on a river. So there are two diversions, an upper and a lower diversion. And what I do here is I simulate multiple scenarios in which we have different operations going on. So what happened here with this project was that the city that was trying to supply water from these two diversions was told by the environmental community that they needed to bypass some certain amount of water at both of their diversions to protect endangered fish. So what you can do with this model is then check a box in this dashboard that enables fish bypass. And if you do that at both diversions, then you see a time series here that can be edited that defines how much water needs to be bypassed. So this is the amount of water that actually cannot be used. You add these up, that amount of water cannot be diverted during those times of the year. Under existing conditions, these two boxes would not be checked. This is the existing system. So the point of this model was to compare, first of all, the existing system to what it would be like after the fish bypass is in place, and then also try to look at scenarios that we try to mitigate the impact of the bypass. So what can we do to the system? Can we add equipment or add new equipment that's bigger, that allows us to produce more water from this river? Also, can we relax some of the existing water right constraints on there, and how does that impact the system? Without scenario analysis, we would have to run the model and look at the change. Well, let me show you what we would do, for example. So let me go back to existing conditions. I'll run this model, and we'll look at a plot, and this shows us how much water was stored over time and how much was used. When the water is being used, this line draws down. When we're storing water or producing water, the line is going up. So this is existing conditions. So then what we would do is say, okay, let's run this model again. But this time I want to enable the bypass. So we run this model again, and then we go look at this plot, and then it shows us this. And you kind of have to remember what you did last time, and remember in your mind the time history, and say, okay, how does that compare? Well, it's less water, but it's kind of hard to know that without seeing the other line. So what we can do with scenarios is have GoldSim remember for us the previous run and store that information in the model, and then when we run the next simulation, it would then compare the two. So let's go back and do that. What I have up here at the top is a scenario controller, and it allows me to choose the scenario that I'm looking at and then run it. I can also add and remove scenarios here with these two buttons. So what I'll do is I'll go back to existing conditions because the name of this scenario is existing conditions. I'll go ahead and run this. All right, so that's done. Let's open up the plot. Now what I want to do is add a new scenario by clicking on this. This scenario will be fish bypass. In place, I guess, in place. So we run this again. So this is the scenario that I just created, built on the one that was previously shown, and then I just changed it slightly by, well, I haven't done it yet, but Now I am. So now I'm checking these boxes to make this new scenario. I run this model, and now you see we have two lines here. I've got existing conditions in red, and our new scenario called fish bypass in place in green. So now immediately what we can see from this is that we're not able to produce as much under this scenario. So let's make a change to the system that will enable us to improve our results here. So what I'll do is add yet another scenario, and I'll call this changes to, well, let's see, improve lower diversion. Okay, so with this scenario, what I'll do is, and since I created this scenario with this previous one in place, it just built upon the previous one as soon as I added it. So it's exactly the same. Right now it's exactly the same as the previous scenario I just looked at. Now I'm going to change it a little bit more. I'll relax the water rights on this diversion and go ahead and run it. Now what we see is that, yes, we were able to improve our production a little bit. So the green line was without any improvements. We've made a few improvements, and you can see that we were able to get closer to our original existing production line, but not quite. So what I want to do now is, rather than go ahead and create another scenario, I'm going to change this existing scenario. Right now, if I look up here at the the scenario controller, you'll see that there's an asterisk here, indicating that it already holds some results in it. That's this blue line. So what I want to do is I want to reset this scenario. I'll click on the reset button here. And now it asks me a question. Do I want to delete all the results for this model? That's the second option. But I don't want to do that. I want to do this first option. Delete results for this scenario, improve lower diversion. That's the current one I'm looking at. I want to delete results just for that one, but not the others. So I'll say OK. When I come up here and click on this, you see that the first two still have results in them, as shown by these two lines here, and the current scenario has no results in it. You can see we've removed the blue line, which was that third scenario. So let's go ahead and change this by adding a new pump. So we're replacing some old equipment, putting some new equipment in there that's able to produce more in our case. So I'll run this, and now what we have here is you can see that we're able to get fairly close to where we were in the existing conditions, and able to produce just as much, almost just as much water. And also what you'll see on our dashboard here is that we have a lot of output displays, like these thermometers and these result displays that are showing values. If I switch between scenarios, those will change. So these output displays will all reflect the current scenario, or what's actually called the active scenario. The active scenario is what's shown here in this controller. So you could also look at distribution result plots, and in this case, since this is not a Monte Carlo simulation, it doesn't show distribution plots, but it actually shows a bar of each of the scenario final values, giving you kind of an overview of what the total amount produced was by each scenario. Okay, so that is a working example of a model and how you might implement scenarios with the dashboard. Are there any questions at this point? And feel free to ask them. I might wait until the end, but I'm happy to answer questions now. And you can just type those in privately, and then I will answer them as we go along if you need to. And you can always just you can type them in, and if I can't get them now, I'll answer them later there. So, okay, let's go to the next one. Now what this model is that this model doesn't have a dashboard yet, and I want to create one. I also need to delete, I have scenarios here, just ignore this for a second. I was supposed to delete these. This came from our morning, but yeah, delete all. This came from my morning presentation. Okay, so this is a model that currently does not have any scenarios. nor does it have a dashboard. The purpose of this model is to calculate a coal production, mining coal, and how much is produced over time, and what the revenues and expenses would be from that. It's actually very simple. There's really nothing to this model except for some stochastic growth generators, essentially. And when I run this model, what we see here is that we are showing how much coal we're producing over time, and then see how it's historic into future. So there's a transition actually in this model going from historic to future. If we look at, let's see, I have another plot here. Is this it? No, let's see. Let me just create a plot real quick here of revenues versus expenses. Oh, this is a Monte Carlo model, so I need to create the result before I try to plot time histories on the fly. So let's see, revenues and expenses. And run the model again. And what we see here is if I go to my custom statistic, which, by the way, my custom statistic is the 15th percentile. Okay. So this is my revenues and expenses there over time. And that's not a very good unit. Let me change this to $1,000 per year. There we go. Okay. Let's see, somebody has a question. So somebody asked, I'm interested in running scenarios with a Monte Carlo simulation, and it seems to crash when I attempt that. Is there a workaround? Okay, well, I have been doing this quite a number of times, haven't had any problems. So I would be very interested in your situation. Maybe we can talk after the webinar about that. I will be doing exactly that in this presentation, so you'll see how I'm doing it. Maybe that will help, but I definitely want to talk to you about that afterwards. Okay, so this model, like I said, is running Monte Carlo. Let me show you the simulation settings. I'm going to go back to edit mode so we can see that. Okay, so this is a 50-year simulation running on 1-year time steps, and nothing really fancy there. Then the Monte Carlo here is showing that I'm running 100 realizations. Okay, so what this model does then is it says we have an existing or a current price and production cost, and then we into the future we have that grow using some history generators here. But then over here I say we have an existing growth rate. But what I do is I say if we're in the future, then I want to go off of a scenario growth of production, and if we're in the past, then I'm going to go off of existing growth production. And really, in a real model, what you would do probably is have a time series right here that says this is the historic recorded production. And you would put that in. I just didn't have a time series, so that's why I'm using a stochastic. So don't be confused by why I'm using a stochastic here. It's just because I didn't have the data. All right, so what I want to do then is I want to say, well, let's look at different production rates moving into the future, different growth rates. You know, what if it grew, what if it was a negative growth into the future? And what if it was just a very small growth, and what if it was a high growth? I want to see all those comparisons moving into the future. So there are two things we need to do here. The first thing we want to do is we want to create our scenarios to just start enabling scenario analysis in this model. So to do that, I'll go up here to Run, and then go to Scenario Manager. You can also type F7 on your keyboard to start that. And here's the Scenario Manager. I currently do not have any scenarios. And without any scenarios defined, GoldSim is not operating with any thought of scenarios at all. It's as if it's just a normal simulation. But as soon as I add a new scenario to GoldSim, there are some things that operate a little bit differently that you need to be aware of. Before I get into that, let's just review a few things about GoldSim. First of all, there's the states of the model that you need to be aware of. Right now, we are in edit mode. How can you tell we're in edit mode in this model? It's because if you look at the input and output ports, you see they're red, indicating that there are no results saved at any of these elements. If I double click on a time history, you see it gives me the properties, not the plot. There are no results here that are saved. Also, very importantly, down in the bottom right corner, now because it's down in the bottom right corner, you might think it's not that important, but it's actually very useful to always be looking at this. Right now it says edit mode. Okay, this tells you the mode of the model. When I go to run the model, during the simulation, it will be running, and that's a different state, but usually models run pretty quickly, and you get right into result mode. Excuse me. So down in the bottom right corner, you see it's green, and it says result mode. Now, if I try to edit an element by double-clicking and typing in here, you'll see it won't let me. Obviously, I'm in edit mode. I can't edit anything. But now, if I double-click on plots, you see I do see the plot there. Okay, so those are the two modes. Now, when I go here to edit mode, when I click on edit mode here, or if I type F4 on my keyboard, it now gives me this option. It says, are you sure you want to delete the model results? And I can either say yes, delete them, or I can save the current results as a scenario. So if I do that, it's going to now create a scenario for me. If I just hit OK, it goes back to edit mode. So let's do that. Let's save the current results as a scenario. As soon as I do that, it says, well, what's the name of this scenario? We'll just call it scenario 1. That's fine. So now what you see is first of all, my cursor is orange. Also, if I go into try to edit something here, then what we have is, let me just do that. What we do, I don't know if you could hear that, but when I try to type it then pings again, telling me that I cannot edit it. So in scenario mode, we're in kind of a different type of mode. It's not result mode because I cannot just right-click on an element and see results. So all of these elements, they don't store results in scenario mode. They do in result mode, well, if you tell it to, right? So, for example, when I double-click on this, you'll see there's a checkbox here that says final values, also Monte Carlo histories. So elements save results when you go into result mode, but in scenario mode, the results are saved. I'm talking about time history results here. Results are saved in the time history elements here. Okay, so if I double click on this, you'll see there is a plot, and this is called scenario 1 right here. And then down on the bottom right, you see it's orange down here, and it says scenario mode, and it also says live model here. So in GoldSim Pro, there's this it's not really a scenario, but it's a type of run. It's a type of I guess you could call it a type of run called live model. And what it means is it's kind of like a sandbox that you can play in, adjust things, and if you like what you see when you run it, then you can save off the results to a scenario and create a scenario. If I click on this label down here, you'll see that it shows two things, live model and scenario 1. So the scenarios are really what we're going to be comparing results on. And you see that it puts an asterisk here next to scenario 1, indicating that this is really the scenario that has the results. Keep in mind that the player model, that when you generate a player, you don't have this live model at all. We felt that would be too much detail for the end user. Really, it's just for it's for you to, as a modeler, to explore, and it allows you to do that and then save off to a new scenario. The player is more for it's a little more structured to make it easier, simpler to use. Okay, so I have saved off a scenario. I'm going back to the scenario manager now. And I will see here that, okay, I have the scenario 1. What I really want to do is I want to call this the existing condition. So I'm just going to double click here, and you can see that by double clicking now, I can change the name. When I hit close, you'll see now when I click on this list down here, or this label, you'll see the name was changed there as well. Okay. All right, so going back to the scenario manager, what we have here is the name, a description. You can type in any description. I don't have one in here, but I could just double click in here and start typing. There's a color that's always associated with this scenario. Now, you don't be confused with the output line, the output colors. If I go to a chart and go to its properties, you'll see that there are colors here. These are totally independent of the scenario colors. Okay, but when we're showing a scenario and comparing scenarios, we're going to be using the scenario line colors. Going back to the scenario manager here. So that's what the colors are used for. You can choose whether or not you want to show this in a plot. So if you had a whole bunch of scenarios, you could just go down the list here and pick which ones you want to show and not show. This next column here, this is the action column where I can choose to run or delete. Well, I can choose to run a scenario. If it's already been run, it will say delete results. So that's my other option. If I hit delete results, it just clears out the results, and so that I could run it again later or change its inputs. Okay, so now we have an existing condition. Now let's add a new scenario. I'll just call this scenario 1. Actually, let me call this low growth. Okay, so this one, it's going to be different than the existing conditions in that I'm now doing a growth projection into the future that's a small amount of growth. And the way that we define scenarios in GoldSim, now I've already mentioned right here we have obviously names of scenarios, but that's not very useful. What we want to do is we want to define the scenario using data that's different for each scenario in GoldSim. The way that scenarios are set up in GoldSim is that you differentiate your scenarios using data elements. Okay, but now you might be thinking, well, what if I want to do 2 scenarios where one has totally different logic or has a whole new system in it? You know, maybe I have this new piece of equipment that I want to add to my model. Well, it's more than just a data element. That's logic in the model. Well, let me explain a few things so you understand. So what this model does is it has 2 things. I have data that's different. I also have logic that's different in my scenario. So what I want to do is I want to define my future growth rate differently for different scenarios. So I'm going to do a low growth, and then I'm also going to do a high growth here. So the high growth would have a high future growth rate. The low growth would have a low future growth rate. The existing conditions wouldn't use that. Okay, so that's how that's going to work. So what I do is I want to define my data as defining my scenario. So I'm going over here to the future growth rate element. First, I'm going to delete all of my results so I can edit. So I'm going to go back to edit mode. I'm coming into this data element, and what you'll see here is that now that I have scenarios defined, there's this extra field here called scenario data, and what I can do is check this box, and that will add this data to my scenario data. If I click this hyperlink, it tells me what the values are for every scenario. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the scenario manager and take a look at this data. So there's this button here that says scenario data. I click on that. I can now see the value that's being used for each scenario. I'm going to say 0 here because that's existing conditions. I'll say 1.5 here, and then 3 there. And this one was, I don't remember what that was, but that's just the live model, which I'm not comparing. So these are the 3 scenarios I'm comparing: existing conditions, low, and high growth. Okay, so that will change the future condition, but then I also need a way to control the logic for each scenario. What I want to do is I want to say if it's existing conditions, I want you to use my existing growth rate. If it's a future run, if it's in the future, I want you to, and if it's not existing conditions, I want you to use this other growth rate. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll have a selector here, and the selector says if the scenario is greater than 0, then use scenario growth. Otherwise, use this other growth rate, which is, let's just say it's some sort of existing conditions. Okay, so I need another data here that's scenario data. And for the existing conditions, this will have a value of 0. For the other ones, it will have some other value. Okay, so I'll check this box here. That will add it to scenario data. You can see the value is always 3. I need to change that. So one way to do that, I just showed you, is in the scenario data table. I could come here to the scenario data table, and I could just manually enter the numbers there like I did before. Another way to do it is to change to the active scenario, or make the scenario you're interested in active, then change the data. So I could do that by going down here to the bottom right and clicking on existing conditions, and as soon as I do that, I am now in an existing condition state, and my data is representative of that. So I can change the scenario to 0 here, and now you'll see if I hover over it, it says 0. If I make low growth my scenario, you'll see this says 3 now. If I go back to existing conditions, this is now a 0. Okay, so we could change our values that way, or we could just do it in this table here. I'll just say 1 and 2 there. Okay, so now that we have the scenario data defined and the scenarios that we want to see, I'm ready to run the scenarios. And I can do that a few different ways. One way is from the scenario manager itself. Now, you don't do this in the player. Okay, in the player, you don't have access to the scenario manager. The way that you manage scenarios in the player is with the scenario controller that I showed you earlier in the dashboard. Now I'm going to run one scenario, and let me close the manager and open this plot. So here's the existing conditions. Going back to the scenario manager, I could just keep clicking on these, or I can click on Run All. And when I do Run All, you'll see that it shows me the other 2 scenarios. So what this model does then is it's kind of in everything that's historic, it's one line because it's known. We know what happened historically, but in the future, these are the things that could happen moving forward, or these are the scenarios that we might look at moving forward. All right. Any questions at this time? Looks like there aren't any questions. Okay. All right. So also, what if we have a plot that has more than one output? If I go over here to this other plot, then, well, in fact, yeah, that's probably the best way to do it. So this plot actually has more than one result, a revenue and expenses. In fact, let's just add one more. Let's add our production. Oh, I think I need to be in edit mode before I can add outputs. Okay, so I'm going to production, and now I'm going to run all my scenarios. Okay, so there are 3 outputs, but you'll see that I'm only looking at one. I'm looking at revenues. When you look at a single output, it will compare all of the scenarios. I can change this to look at any other output. This is expenses, and this is production. So if I want to, I could compare the outputs instead by coming down here and going to scenario existing conditions. So this is just the existing conditions, all 3 outputs. And you'll see that as I flip through this, GoldSim is then smart enough to display the legend that corresponds to whatever I'm looking at here. This is the low growth and high growth, etc. So I can also look at all results, all scenarios. Once you start looking at more than about 3 outputs, 3 scenarios, this kind of a chart would become very busy and hard to read. But with just a few like this, it can be quite informative because it can show you if we'd probably have to expand this. If I expand this chart, then you can see that the revenues, expenses, and production are all kind of corresponding as they move up there. Also note that if I choose an output that is not able to show multiple lines or multiple outputs for, if I choose a display type that can't do that, for example, probabilities, with a probabilities type plot can only show one output at a time. If I do that, then what I'm limited on this 4 button here on what I'm showing. So this now only gives me the ability to show one output at a time, and it just lists all of them. It lists the revenues for each scenario, the expenses for each scenario, etc. If I show a single realization, I can obviously have all of the flexibility, because that's just showing one line for each output. All realizations would be the same thing. We can only show one thing at a time. But statistic, or like my custom statistic, which I have been showing you, we have all that flexibility there. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind. All right, so that's all nice. But let's talk about creating a dashboard. That's what this webinar is about. So I'll delete my results and create a new dashboard. All right, here's my dashboard. I'll enter the dashboard here, and it's a blank canvas. Now I can start adding controls and graphics to my dashboard. So those of you who are new to dashboards, what you'll see when you enter a dashboard is usually it's on the right. You'll see a toolbar here that has graphics and dashboard controls, a list of dashboard controls. They're all pretty straightforward. What I can start with is this button right here, just a standard button. And what I can do here is I can tell it to show me a plot. So because I want to show, I want to do scenario comparisons. So I'll call this production. In fact, rather than link to the production plot, let me link to this one right here. I'm going to call this something else. I'll call this production revenues and expenses. So this is sort of new to GoldSim. You can add a description and have the description be displayed as the header using a keyword. So let me show you what I mean. Production revenues and expenses. So I can now, when I run the model, and I open this plot, I can go here to the chart style, go to the header, and change this keyword, which is currently the name of the element. I can change this keyword to the result description, like that, and it will put that description in there that I just typed. Okay, so let's now link to that element. I'm deleting my results of this regular run. I didn't do a scenario run. I just did a full GoldSim run here. When I went to delete my results, I'm now presented with this question that says, do you want to delete the current model results and keep the scenario results, or do you want to just delete everything? And right now I want to delete everything because I'm editing the model. So I'm going to go all the way back to edit mode. Somebody asked, in terms of scenarios, we can only vary data, or can we vary the logic as you mentioned? Okay, very good question. So what I was trying to say here is that while it's true you can only edit the data, that's the only thing that really varies by scenario. The fact is that your logic in your model is subject to that data, so you have to build the logic around that. Build logic around the data that's changing as a way to create your scenarios. So for example, we didn't make GoldSim so that on a specific scenario all of a sudden a whole container would appear and a bunch of elements would all of a sudden appear. It's not like that. So what you would do then is, let's say you wanted to have you wanted to put in a new production plant in this model that entails a container full of 100 elements or something, and it doesn't even exist in existing conditions. Well, what you would do in GoldSim is you would put it in the model. It would always be there, but under existing conditions, the production that would come from that new plant would not be used. You could use selector elements. You could use logic elements in your model to make use of that information. You can also you can have conditional containers, for example. Put a condition on your container and everything's deactivated, right? So what you could do is you could say, well, under this scenario, I want to deactivate this container. Otherwise, I want to activate it, and that would be a way of turning on and off an entire component of a system, a very complex component of a system. So it's very easy actually to control the logic in your model using the scenario data, if that makes sense. It's because it's so easy to build logic in GoldSim and control major components of the system using things like what I just said, selectors and conditional containers and so forth. Even submodels can be activated and deactivated using custom logic. So it would be very easy to do that. So I hope that answers your question. If you have any specific question about your application later on, I'd be happy to help there. Okay, so we're sitting in here in the dashboard. I'm clicking on this button, and now I will go to show result, and this is the results I want to show. Okay, and you'll see now it's kind of hard to see the button because we're in edit mode. Plus the color I'm using, it's all gray. But if I click on activate, then you can see there's the button there that's active. And so active, means that I can now interact with the dashboard, but I have not run the model. So there are no results yet. If I click on this button, you'll see it'll show the chart, but there's nothing there yet. Next thing we want to do is add our scenario controller, which is the next item down. So I click on that, and I'll just make this a little bit longer because my names are kind of long, or could be. So I'll put that there, and now when I activate the dashboard, I'm all ready to go, essentially. So I can go ahead and run this, and now we are in existing conditions. I can go to a different scenario and run it, and you'll see there they are. So immediately I have the ability to do my scenario runs from this dashboard. But now what we want to do is we want to interface our dashboard with our data that's changing by scenario. So let me go back to edit mode and deactivate the dashboard, and now we'll add a slider. Okay, so I want this slider to adjust my my growth scenario data. So if I go back to the scenario data table, I'm talking about this future growth rate percentage right here. So I want to be able to slide that back and forth between some negative number and some positive number. So I'll connect this just by double clicking on it, select the data that I'm talking about, and in my case it's the future growth rate. And I want the default, I guess, just to be 0, but I want it to be able to go down to -5 and up to 5. And we'll say I'll be able to adjust it by a tenth. Okay. And I probably need some sort of label on here too. In fact, I'm just going to do something like that. Now I just need to expand this a bit. There it is. Okay. So now what I can do is I can go to each of my scenarios and adjust the slider. You'll see that as I move through each scenario here using the scenario selector, you'll see that the slider is adjusting. And that's because GoldSim has associated this control with the scenario data, which is being adjusted by scenario. As soon as I connect this to the dashboard, when I go and look at the scenario data table, something is different. Instead of entering a number just by typing it, now there's a hyperlink on the number. And when I click on it, it shows me the control that was in the dashboard. See how it's gone out of the dashboard here? It's now here sitting in front of me. And the reason we do this is because you may not be in the dashboard when you click on this. So for example, I might be in the model somewhere over here. And if I go to the scenario manager, scenario data, and then I want to change this value, it actually takes the component from the dashboard and displays it here for me. So I can make the adjustment here and close it, and it will be adjusted there. Okay, so let's say I wanted to change this low growth to a negative growth here. So make that negative. And keep in mind that if I switch scenarios or switch my active scenario using this key or this label down here, then I should be able to see the value that's changed here. All right. So now I have the ability to flip through each of these scenarios, adjust the input for it, view a plot, go to a different scenario, run it, view the plot, and it shows me that change. And if I don't like it, I can click on edit mode, and I can delete the results just for this scenario, change it, run it again, and see the immediate effect of that scenario. So I can also add other output controls to this model. So let me change that. So we have some others here. So I could add, a result display here. So I could link this to production. Maybe what I want to do, since this is a Monte Carlo simulation, I want to display Monte Carlo results. So instead of just showing the final value of the last realization, that's not very useful. What I want to do is I want to say, well, what's my final production as a statistic? So I'll click on this, and now I already have a distribution result element in the model, which is linked to the production. And I should really rename that. Let me do that. That's this is final production. Okay, so if I come back here, look at this, and you'll see it's the production here. And now I can choose the statistic that I want to have displayed here. And I'll just keep it the mean. So then I could just, I probably should just label that. Let's see, put that here. All right, so now when I run the model, it shows me its value there. And as I switch to a new scenario, the value disappears because we haven't run this model yet. If I run that, you'll see it appears. So any of these scenarios that has an asterisk next to the name has results. So if I click on a different scenario, you'll see it'll show me that value there. Okay. So there are some other outputs we can show. Here's another result display. We can also include this one here, which is called a status result. And a status result lets you display a certain image based on some value of an output. So we could do that. We could also do, a thermometer that shows a bar dependent on a result, and also a text. This is just going to display some text label that's based on some conditional statement here with a value that's corresponding to an output element in your model. Okay, so somebody asked here, can you show the same that you did with scenarios using the mean? So I'm assuming that you're talking about the time history plots. So if I run the simulations, and let me just go here to the scenario manager and run all the scenarios, and then show the plot here. And so now if you want to see the mean, right now we're looking at the 15th percentile. You'll see that it says down here at the bottom. So I can just go to a statistic here and display the mean. I can grab any percentile that I want here, actually. So that's pretty useful. Also, I can come over here to my properties, and I can say I want to show the 15th percentile there, and I want to show the mean here. I don't know this doesn't, in this context, doesn't make a lot of sense to do this, but you may want to show the same output twice. So like expenses here again. And by the way, I need to rerun the model because you can't just add any outputs. So let me go ahead and run this model again. Just running all the scenarios. Okay, so I could then compare the mean and the default of the same output there. If I went to expenses, expenses there. Okay, I need to look at that and remember how I do this. So I'll have to do that at the end. But that's probably not the question that you had. Also, let's see. Okay, I don't know if that answers your question or not. But yeah, you can show different statistics there, and you can also do the same for the final values. So that would include, if I go back to this, if I go back to this one here, you can show other, statistics besides just the mean there as well. Okay, so another question is, can you show the PDF of the output? Yes, I can, and that would require yet another button. So let's do that. So if I add another button that says show results, then I can connect to my distribution production result there. And when I run this model, then you can see, if I click on that, then you can see the distribution for each scenario. So there are a lot of options. I mean, it's a very rich interface, but it's extremely the scenario manager itself and the way that it's set up with dashboards is extremely flexible. The sky's the limit essentially as far as what you want to compare and look at, which is very nice. Okay, one more thing, that is exporting results to Excel. So sometimes you need to export your results and also your scenario results to Excel, and GoldSim allows you to do that. So let me show you that real quick. Let's say I want to take my production revenues and expenses and export this to Excel. So I'll just go ahead and open up this the properties of this chart, and I will go to down here at the bottom, export results to Excel, and then click on the export tab. Now what I want to do is I can either select an existing file or create a new one. I'll just create a new one, and I'll call this scenario export to, and it will create the file. There's the new file, and now what I can do is I can select the sheet that I want to export to and the cell. I'll just say A4 here. The next thing I want to do is choose whether I want to clear the previously written range. So the reason this is here mainly is because when you're dealing with scenarios, sometimes you'll run 4 scenarios and it will export a certain area to a certain area within your spreadsheet. Then next time you run 2 scenarios, well, that's a smaller area. You don't want to have the other 2 scenarios still in the spreadsheet when you export this next run. It would be confusing. So you probably want to clear the previously written cell range before you export when you're dealing with scenarios especially. I'll just uncheck the confirm before overwriting, and I'll export automatically when it completes. The next thing down here, now we don't have any reporting periods, so don't worry about that. But on exporting scenarios, I have the option of grouping my results together. So in my case, I've got expenses, revenues, and production. I can group those together in Excel, or I can group the scenarios together for one result at a time. I'll go ahead and group the results together there. And let me just check the model options here in the results to see when it export. So right here it's going to say prompt before. If I just choose this export right after, then let's see, go here, run all, and there it's exporting the results automatically. And now I can go ahead and open the Excel file there. I could create a button in here in the dashboard that allows me to open the Excel file right to the sheet that I'm interested in, or I can just go and browse to the file, or I can go here to the export tab, and I need to be in edit mode to get there. Anyway, you could make it very simple, very easy to access that Excel file. I'm just going over here to the place where I saved it. Okay, what you'll see here though is that we have two sheets now, and there's nothing in sheet one. That's where I told the data to go, right? Well, actually what GoldSim does is when you run scenarios, it operates a little bit differently. If I do just a regular GoldSim run, it will export the results to sheet one. But see this next line down? Scenario comparisons are exported to sheet one dash scenarios. So GoldSim appended a new sheet automatically to this file that has the text dash scenarios after whatever sheet that I've connected to. So what you could do is, if you plan in the future to never run the model in any other way besides scenario mode, and a good example of that is a player. If you're passing out a player to your end users and they're doing scenario runs, what you could do is just hide this tab. Just hide the tab like that. When they open the file, this is all they're going to see. This is all they care about. So they won't even see the other sheet. But you have to have the sheet one there because that's what GoldSim is looking at. And also for your runs, when you just do a regular run, it will go to that. The results will go to the sheet one. But what you'll see here is that the way that these are grouped, so you'll see it says revenues, revenues, revenues. I have grouped my results together, and it's showing the sorry, it's actually grouping the, let's see, let me see how it's stated. Group results together. Okay, so I've got my result together, and then I have that for all three scenarios, and then again these results for those three scenarios and so forth. Okay, and you'll see also here that I specified I'm looking at the mean and the 15th percentile, so you'll see it shows both of those there. Okay, so something else that you want to keep in mind. So I mentioned earlier the live model. So just remember that the live model, which is shown here in GoldSim Pro, if you go to the player, you will not see the live model there. Also, you can predefine scenarios before you generate the player, and that way that when you pass out the player, that you'll have all those scenarios already populated. But the user of the player model will always be able to add and or delete scenarios in the player. So you can make them available, but you can't set them in stone, so to speak. Also, the user of the player model can save results, can save the state of whatever they've changed in their model there. And let's see if there's anything else here that I've missed. I think that's about it. So anyway, I hope this was useful for helping you understand how to build models with using the scenario capability, and also having that interaction in your dashboard and your models. I think it's a very powerful tool, and it's very useful for helping build models that assist in decision making, and also creating a model that's very easy to use for doing scenario analysis. So thank you very much for joining, and now I will take any questions that you might have. I'll stick around for 10 or 15 minutes and be happy to take any questions you have at this time. Thanks again for joining.